Hello, everyone. A really, really warm welcome to everyone in the room and everyone online. We're here, very excitingly, to launch a book, to launch How to Make an Entrepreneurial State, Why Innovation Needs Bureaucracy. We're joined by the three authors who are sitting here in the middle, Rainer, Wolfgang, and Erkki. And I'll just give you a brief overview of what the session today is going to look like. So we're going to first hear from the authors, and then there's going to be a brief video from Mariana Mazzucato, who's the director of Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose. And then following that, we're joined by two guests, Mike Bracken, who's sitting here in the room, who's a partner at Public Digital and also previously co-founded the government's digital services here in the UK. And online, we're joined by Darja Isaksson, who is the Director General of the Swedish innovation agency Vinnova. We'll have a bit of a discussion, and then there's going to be a bit of time for question and answers. So please, people online, feel free to ask questions as we go. And then, of course, in the room, we'll come to you when it's that time. So, as a brief introduction to myself, I am Pooja Agrawal, and I am the CEO and co-founder of an organization called Public Practice. And I'm also a fellow at the Institute, so it felt like a very, thank you, Rainer, for inviting me to chair this. What Public Practice does is look at the capability of local government in the UK. And it's all about building specific capabilities around the built environment. So that's architecture and planning and sustainability expertise and community engagement expertise, for example. And I suppose one of the things we do is attract talent from the private sector and put them into local government, saying this is why you should work in local government in the public sector, because this is where you can have the biggest impact. When we ask our potential candidates, but also our associates when they start the program, what they're most nervous about joining the public sector, the number one thing, I'm saying this on evidence-based, anecdotally, I'm aware I'm in a room full of academics. I'm not. So one of the key things that comes out is being worried about bureaucracy, being really worried about how long things will take, how decisions are made, how they're going to actually be able to make an impact in their year-long placement, and what barriers, how they're going to be able to find their way to navigate that, because they're used to sort of creative working, innovative ways of working. So I'm so excited to see a book that brings together this oxymoron of innovation and bureaucracy, because often they're seen as being two completely different sides of the mindset. So just with that brief introduction, I'm going to hand over to the authors to talk about the book.
Yes, thank you so much, Pooja. And yeah, the microphone is only for the people online, not for you. So don't worry if you don't hear them reverberation in the room. So thanks very much for coming. So it's great to see you, all of you here, and people online as well. And yeah, thanks Pooja and Mike and Darja for joining us. It's very kind of you to spend an evening with us talking about bureaucracy, so, which is a probably for many people it might be actually a really good idea. Or if you would ask Mariana, who unfortunately can't be here, what's the sort of like the punchline of the book is how to make bureaucracy sexy. I'm not sure we actually managed to do that, but that would be her interpretation of it. Or well, we'll hear in a 15 minutes time. So what we'll do is we have no slides, so we'll just speak about the book a bit. I'll do an introduction, and then my co-authors add bits and pieces here and there. And they're the versions of the book, I think. And I think what we have to start from is that the book has a really unique authorship, because Wolfgang was my PhD supervisor, and I was Erkki's PhD supervisor. So you have this 3 generation of PhDs. And I think we weren't far enough to have a 4th generation, because it took like 10 years to write the book. So I think it's it can be like a cute thing that we wrote it together, but it's also, it took us a really long time to get there. So it's, everybody got their PhDs in the meantime. So, but it's still it also shows, of course, that there is a lot of continuity and a lot of thinking about these things. And what really the focus of the book is to talk about implementation rather than politics or policy. And it really focuses on how do you actually innovate in government and how governments support innovation. And it takes a very long sort of historical look at these issues. And because it took so long, I think it's also like 2 books in one, actually. So it pretty much has a theoretical and much more foundational discussion how governments actually innovate themselves as organizations, how do they change? And then it's also a discussion of industrial and innovation policy. And it sort of brings them together, I hope, in the final chapter. So if you don't read anything else, you can read the introduction and the final chapter, as is the case with many books these days, I think. Here, you know that people sort of lose interest, and only the graduate students pay attention to the chapters in the middle. And so, because I think that what we try to do in the final chapter is really to show that actually today, particularly, you cannot sort of separate that government supports other organizations, particularly universities or public organizations, private organizations, to innovate, but actually government itself needs to be thinking about how does it innovate as well. And I think we very much used a good friend of ours, Dan Hill, who's like Mike, a visiting professor of practice and worked at Vinnova. And Dan Hill asked when he went to work in Vinnova, why are not innovation agencies in government actually innovating? Why are they supporting private organizations to innovate? Why not themselves actually engaging actively in innovation? I think this is very much sort of the starting point for the book as well. So we asked, how do actually bureaucracies, not only how do they implement innovation and industrial policy, but how do they actually change and innovate themselves? How do they bring creativity and change into the public agencies? And I think the question, as Pooja was saying, is a slightly oxymoronic, because we don't think that these things go together. And for very good reason, because many public services are there focusing on long-term stability, routine kind of services, almost regular, everyday garbage collection, all of those things that need to be done, or building stuff. So this is what public sector is very much about, this long-termism. And one of the examples we use in the book is about an example from Northern Africa, actually, Roman baths, public baths, that are still there since 2000 years. They're still the same function. People go there to get clean and swim and have a community good time. But it's something that has the same function since 2000 years. It was in the beginning a very radical innovation, but now you can add you can add a electronic digital layer of booking time, but it's not really about radically innovating anymore. It's this very long-term view of public sector, and that's actually the norm of public sector. So public organizations, when they're good, are very good at providing this long-term, very stability-oriented function. And I think that if you don't read much of the book, you can read the two mottos we have for the book. And again, so I'm providing you with really good nuggets how to read the book. And the first one comes from Brian Eno, so the music producer and, of course, advisory board member of IIPP. And he says that in one of the talks that he did together with Finn Williams, who's a co-founder with Pooja of Public Practice, you see how everything sort of hangs together here. And he said that bureaucrats are very much stabilizing knowledge and keep things running, and at times radically innovating. And a lot of the public services are like that. Bureaucrats are actually the ones that keep things running in society, and they're supposed to be unsexy in a way. They're supposed to keep things kind of running and very much focusing on stability. And then the very last thing we added to the book is the second motto. He's a good friend of ours, Mike's as well, from Estonia, Siim Sikkut. He used to be the government's chief information officer, and he left his office last year, and he gave like an exit interview. And in that interview, he said that one of the main challenge for me as a government chief information officer in Estonia was that I needed to look after the digital infrastructure, keep it running, keep it safe, keep it, humming, the digital identity, all of that. And at the same time, I needed to all the time think, what is the next step for us? What is the next level of, going ahead? What is the next level of innovation? And this kind of ambidexterity, doing these things at the same time, is really where our sort of main theoretical contribution comes from, that we bring these things together and actually argue that what makes governments good, what makes entrepreneurial states good, is when they can do these things at the same time, to provide for agile stability. They can provide for agility and stability at the same time. And of course, historically, that has been very, very difficult thing to do. As I said, government organizations are very good at providing stable functions. And what the book really is very much about then is how do we bring these things together and how has it been done historically? So we look at various different examples. And of course, what is interesting is if you have a book about bureaucracy, you have to talk about Max Weber, of course, because he was the person who really defined the particularly Western view of bureaucracy, what we think about the state. And of course, he talked about bureaucracy as an expert bureaucracy, very much led by people who know. So if you want to build a bridge, you want somebody to know how to build a bridge, because otherwise, the bridge might not work. And all those things. So it's very much driven by this expertise and long-term accountability kind of view. And what we were really interested in, how does these organizations change? How do they change, actually? How does innovation come into these organizations? And what we found historically is that almost always behind that change and innovation is what we call, of course, today, you have to call them bureaucracy hackers. People who actually know their way around bureaucracy, like Mike Bracken on our left. And is not for nothing, he's an example of somebody who came from outside, but not from private sector, actually. He was from the Guardian, from the civic sector, and actually changed radically what it means to do a digital government in UK, actually. And he created an organization very much what Max Weber would call in the image of charismatic networks or charismatic personalities, create their own rules. And what is interesting from our perspective is how those rules actually then become professionalized. They become boring, everyday things to do. And I think that was probably your goal in government. How do you make digital so boring that everybody knows how to do it? And that's really if I may summarize, how what's your, sorry, you will probably have a different view on that. But I think that's sort of what we show, that this is how it happened. And we go back in history, we show like a gentleman called Werner von Siemens of the Siemens company was very pivotal in creating a lot of scientific institutions in Germany in a similar way. He was outsider, he partially funded. I don't think Mike funded any of the public digital infrastructure in UK. But so there's this kind of like a movement between bureaucracy hackers who come in and create new organizations, bring innovations into government. And then these innovations are co-opted into government. They become standard practice. And that's how we argue, at least, the change happens. And that's how innovation happens. So you need this agile stability. And the bulk of the book really discusses the cases from US and Europe and Asia as well. How do these organizational configurations actually happen? How do they take shape? And of course, we argue that there is Weber type 1, Weber type 2, and eventually also we think Weber type 3 organizations that, Weber type 1 is the organizations that are very much focused on stability and expertise. Weber type 2 are organizations that are very much charismatic networks and charismatic organizations. And Weber type 3, like Vinnova, Darja Isaksson is here, are organizations that try to bring all of that together, try to be both focusing on stable long-term functions, investing in companies or helping universities to innovate, but also themselves actually bringing in new ways of working, innovative practices, and trying to bring that together. I think I've spoken long enough, so I want to give floor to my co-authors to add. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you also from my side. Recently, some very good colleagues of mine at Harvard Medical School and School of Public Health published research that was about what makes you age. And one of them is exercise and the other one is diet, right? We all know that. That means if you eat healthily, you live longer. And if you run a lot or exercise a lot, you live longer. But what people think, what is the general view, is that you can balance one with the other. Now you might, obviously you might now see where I'm going with this anecdote. The result of this research seems to show, and it was like based on 35,000 case studies, so relatively large, that you cannot outrun a bad diet and you can't out-eat being a slacker. You do need both in all cases. Why is this so important? For me, I think this is a great metaphor for our concept of agile stability. You do need, in an innovation bureaucracy, as well as generally in the public sector, be agile and stable at the same time, and you cannot balance out one through the other. Yeah, this is not possible. You can't compensate one to the other, but you do need both at the same time. And as Rainer mentioned, that is tough. But to here paraphrase Derek Bock, it's still okay if you look at the alternatives, which means failing in the challenges of our times. Bureaucracy needs to be agile and stable at the same time. The one thing I would like to emphasize or underline here is that although bureaucracies have this tendency towards stability, as Rainer pointed out, in circles like ours, the ones who do the research and the writing and the publishing, it is agility that doesn't need any bands to play their praise, that you need to, to speed up your digital transformation. This is kind of, yeah, I mean, that's not, who is going to say we don't need more digitality? Yeah, this is not the discourse. What has fallen into disrepute is the stable side of the bureaucracy. Yeah, so a lot of people assume that in many Western bureaucracies, be it the UK, be it Germany, and so on, we have the solid bureaucracy. They are just not agile enough. The problem very often is these days that the stability is missing also, or has been lost because of the assaults of the neoliberal reforms of the previous quarter century. So that you can simply not assume that the most productive public orders that we have are stable and need to be agile, but everybody needs to look at both at the same time. Of course, we use bureaucracy, and in a certain way, to come back to what you said, why innovation needs bureaucracy, that's an oxymoron on purpose. Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's supposed to shock you just a little bit. This is why Yale University Press liked this rather than another title, because as I like to say, we PA scholars, we are probably the only people who use the term bureaucracy in a neutral way. For everybody else, it's an insult. If you call somebody, you bureaucrat, that's never friendly. Unless you're a professor of public administration or public management, then it's a specific thing. But it's the rule of the bureau, right? This is what this word means, and it means this from the beginning on. But if you look at the highly competent, stable public sector that evenly and long time structures life in the benefit of also a changing and also a more inclusive society, then you do arrive at a realization of why that stability is really important. And that, it seems to me, needs almost a little bit more of an argument, again, in the discursive field in which we are, than the agility, which is more intuitive. So thank you very much from my side, and the mic goes to Erkki.
So I'm supposed to give the third version of the book now. Okay, but I'm not going to do that. Maybe I just tell a bit of what I reflect upon after writing this book. Is that, first of all, the book has 7 chapters for a simple reason. The editors and publishers said that you don't have time to write an 8th chapter. Let's publish it now, right? But if there would have been an 8th chapter, I guess almost automatically this would have been something related to climate change or sustainability. And if you think about that topic, to some extent, the challenges are similar to the overall story of agile stability. We had economic development issues 40 years ago, 30 years ago. Then we had digitalization challenges and so on. But now when we look at to the future, we have climate change issues, sustainability issues in general. And I think the problems are characteristically similar, but the challenges are much bigger, right? So you need to be agile in a much more kind of systemic way to some extent. You need to really rethink food systems, rethink mobility, transport, housing, whatever. But once you have a solution, you need to be able to scale these things in a very fast pace, right? So if you think about 50 years ago, when you had like moon missions or whatever, you had 20, 30, 40 years to build the industries around that. Mobile phones, whatever, came to maturity very long after the original innovations. But now we have probably 10, 15 years. So if you think back to that, you probably need bureaucracy to be able to be much more stronger and bolder in terms of, scaling new ideas or new initiatives. So I think this is kind of the 8th chapter, right? So that, a radically stronger and radically more courageous bureaucracy. Maybe somebody else will write that as a PhD thesis or something like that. But as a second comment I wanted to say is that most of the time, like Wolfgang was saying that, bureaucracy is a bad term, but bureaucracy is also, you can think about it also as a managerial style or something like that, right? So for the last maybe 30, 40 years, we often kind of think that new managerial practices come from private sector and then public sector somehow internalizes it. But I think that we should always also look at this kind of what Rainer coined as neoliberal agencies and study these in the public sector when they really deal with this kind of complicated challenges that maybe for the next 20 years, we will find new best practices in management actually from these organizations as well, instead of just only borrowing from the private sector practices. And yeah, that's the 8th chapter. Oh, that was 9th chapter, the new management school, right? So 2nd edition is coming, but we're not going to probably write it in 3 again because it's going to take 10 years of fighting. So it was 10 years in the making, but maybe like half a year in writing and 9 years in fighting or something like that. But that's the life of, a family or whatever we are. So thanks.
Great. We're now going to have a little video from Mariana, who is apparently working abroad.
Hello there. My name is Mariana Mazzucato. I'm a professor here at University College London, where I direct the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And it's an absolute honor for us at the Institute to be launching with the co-authors of this book, How to Make an Entrepreneurial State, Why Innovation Needs Bureaucracy. And the 3 authors, as you know, are Rainer, Wolfgang, and Erkki. And Rainer, of course, is not just a good friend, but he's the deputy director of this institute that I crazily set up in 2017, precisely on the grounds of what this book makes so clear, that we need to go beyond the kind of state versus private sector dichotomy. What we really need are entrepreneurial ecosystems in order to tackle the most challenging difficulties that we have today around climate, around health, around the digital economy. And we're not doing that. We're not doing that because we're stuck. We're stuck with a very problematic private sector that is wed to just maximizing shareholder value, but we're also stuck in this kind of old policy domain where the public sector at best is seen as important for fixing market failures, for redistributing the value created in the private sector, for de-risking the entrepreneurs in places like Silicon Valley, and all the words we use for policymakers are pretty boring, right? It's all about de-risking, enabling, leveling the playing field. So, that doesn't work. Had we done that, we wouldn't have gotten all the, amazing technologies, the general purpose technologies that people like Carlota Perez and myself have written about, everything that makes our iPhone smart and not stupid, the internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri actually came out of entrepreneurial public investment. And what, of course, I mean by that is risk-taking investment. There was no guarantee that any of those technologies, which I just mentioned, would actually succeed. Similarly with solar, with even fracking, right? This isn't a normative point. Some problematic technologies have also come out of a state institution. So the real question is, what have we learned? Kind of what works, what doesn't? And also, how can we steer that kind of public investment, but also the planning process, not just to military industrial complex kind of problems, but really, the sustainable development goals. I wrote about this in Mission Economy. I asked, why is it that we only take seriously and treat with urgency through a mission-oriented perspective wars? What would it mean to actually really tackle the food crisis, the water crisis, the digital economy crisis, where we have a huge digital divide, the next pandemic that we're going to face? What if we really treated these with equal seriousness, but really with that kind of dynamic public-private partnership, which got us to the moon and back in a short amount of time? And what this book does so brilliantly is it unpacks that question. It unpacks it really at the level of the organization in which different types of public entities are formed, but really at that level of the bureaucracy. And there's really no reason for the word bureaucracy to be such a negative word. We just have the wrong bureaucracies. Bureaucracies can be agile, they can be flexible, they can be creative, or they can be really inertial, inflexible, very top down. And what the book does is it talks about state bureaucracies and looks at how they can actually support the flourishing of innovation across the economy and society, through specific, though, types of characteristics. These characteristics are, first, these bureaucracies need to provide stability consisting of established, enduring, and secure sets of rules and relationships and procedures for making things happen, for distributing resources, for directing flows of capital, for arbitrating over disputes, which of course happen all the time, so playing that brokering role, and for guaranteeing against insecurities of various types. Second, it's very important that these bureaucracies not become these kind of vertical dinosaurs, but that are themselves agile and able to shift, shape, and respond in reflexive and creative ways to changing contextual conditions and policy problems. That's the whole point, right? How do we actually form, design, learn how to build a flexible, agile, creative bureaucracy? And what they do, and really expertly argue, is that it's this combination of stability and agility that gives state bureaucracies that unique capability to cultivate change and creativity, all the while protecting past innovation gains and embedding these into existing governance arrangements for long-term endurance. And I think this is really the moment for this book, because we've also learned globally, Rainer and I have written about this with the UNDP, that societies really weren't ready for COVID-19, even on some really basic tasks like providing personal protection equipment to frontline workers, but also the test and trace system. The digital divide is so large that this lockdown that we experienced for 2 years just increased inequality in terms of not allowing young people to have the equal access to their human right to education. So these are just, really difficult, complex, wicked challenges that that absolutely require governance. We need to govern that challenge, and it's not just about throwing money at a problem. It's about also really forming that organizational adaptation and ability to both plan and to work with others in the room. In Mission Economy, I cited Ernest Bracken, the head of procurement, who already back in the 1960s was starting to see the organizational challenges inside NASA. And he said, if we keep outsourcing our capacity and not taking kind of bureaucratic change seriously, we're going to end up getting captured by brochuremanship. And they didn't have PowerPoints back then, so captured by brochuremanship, he meant that the public sector would become so unagile, unflexible, and inertial that it wouldn't even know how to write the terms of reference with the private sector. It wouldn't even know how to choose which private companies to work with. So remember, this book and all the work we do in the Institute is never about the state versus the private sector. It's really about collective intelligence. How do we work together? And what's the governance challenge for doing so? And so again, I couldn't be more thrilled that this book launch is happening inside the Institute, that Rainer and myself have been leading for some years. We've just welcomed David Eves as one of the deputy directors as well. And I just want to end off by saying that I'm sure there's some students in the room. And for us, it's been thrilling to be able to think with the students and with everyone in the Institute together about forming really a new way of training and forming bureaucracies, starting with the curriculum, the education really that we provide to those working inside the civil service. So our MPA program is very different from those programs that are still fed today by new public management and public choice theory, which again, the book talks about, but really starts with the new idea of values collectively created. What does that mean to actually put state bureaucracies at the center of that collective creation of value? Second, we look at purpose and systemic change, and what is a purpose-oriented organization versus one that's just kind of distributing funds here and there to, important projects like funding small, medium enterprises. That's very different from actually being challenge and purpose-oriented. What does a purpose-oriented bureaucracy look like? What have we learned about design thinking and the need for that? It's not about long-term planning or design thinking. It's really bringing some really interesting insights from design thinking to the planning process itself. So the fact that I'm sure there's students in the room in a building which houses 60 people who together are really trying to rethink state bureaucracies, being able to launch this book by Rainer, Wolfgang, and Erkki is again a great honor. Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there. We're off in Barbados, believe it or not on holiday, but working with a government which is very interested in these ideas, as is the world. So welcome everybody, and thank you to our 3 authors who did such a great job on this book. And I really look forward to seeing it in action. I'm sure there will be many workshops with different types of actors around the world around this book. So thanks again and good luck.
Great. So I'd love to bring in our guests who are here today, and there's going to be time for questions in about half an hour. So do think about what you'd like to ask this amazing people here. So Mike, if I come to you first, firstly, Mariana touched on the point of values. So it'd be really nice to hear a little bit about the value system that GDS was based on, which I know is touched on in the book, but also maybe respond to this sort of title of being a bureaucratic hacker, as it were.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the invitation. And well done on the book. I wrote a book, took 30 years, so 11 years is nothing. So really well done. I'll talk briefly about when you very kindly mentioned GDS in the book. The first thing I'm going to say is thank you for writing this book. It is tremendous, and I want to say this because you're here. It's given me, and I think some of my friends who worked in government, an idea of the place in which we were working. I strongly think if I'd read this book before going into government, we wouldn't have done that. There is a generally good thing of being a useful idiot when you're just trying to fix something and not worry too much about the Bavarian background and so on. So thank you very much for putting it in that place in history. And I think that to the point about the values, I can't thank you enough for having this sort of agility and stability model for all the praise or recognition in this country that GDS gets, and there's many others, Vinnova and others. It's built on career civil servants like Tony Singleton and Kathy Settle and Chris Chance, who had done 35 years in the public sector in this country, and they set up a stable several hundred people strong institution in the center of government, when an awful lot of the center of that government was really very strongly wishing they would go away. And that was like very hard work, and you need to hack your way around a system like Whitehall have in this country really well to do that. Like the guy called Chris Chant, who preceded me, he had my job title, and he decided to stay in government for a year to see me in. He literally walked me around Whitehall, and I'd walk out of the room of a meeting and go, that was great, wasn't it? And he'd go, no, they're trying to sack you. And I literally would have got nowhere without him. And that sort of stability meant that 2 years later, we were innovating, as you guys point out, on critical national infrastructure. And I think the core message that the book points out is, because these things comes in waves, the values that we brought, which essentially were the values of the internet age, which is networked operations and critically putting users at the heart of our thinking rather than government itself. You only get a limited period of time before the wave comes back on the beach and knocks you off. And we had 5.5 years of it, and I'm glad that we focused on that. And at every point, as the book indicates, you have a minimal time. And any reform that we did, I don't like the phrase disruption, but any reform, or call it bureaucratic hacking, had at its heart a sense of what can they not change. And I do think that the book puts out very clearly a sense that in the last 20 years, a sort of what you call the neoliberal assault. And I don't disagree, by the way, but there's a sort of nuance there which is worth pointing out. The ambidextrous nature of it was, and by the way, I'm ambidextrous, so I'd like to do that. We were a digital government trying essentially to reform government services that were fundamentally broken in many cases for user needs, and using the very language of austerity to justify doing that. And it can be done, but you do have to be ambidextrous. You have to play both games at once. And you can only play that game. It's like walking a tightrope. You can only stay on there for a period of time. And I think that what the book does is it identifies these two themes about the assault you face in government whilst the values that you're trying to uphold, and shows how to do them. I think the sort of the moment in time now is how to sustain those, how to take on reforms that can be managed and sustained and shared. And what I'd summarize that with is like, the answer to that is the internet. If you get it open and out on the internet, get thousands of people using it, it's very hard to put back in the box. And I think that the biggest trend in the book that probably I would pick out more is that you identify trends since, before the war, all the way through. The biggest single change has been the move of technology of being an enterprise play, which is essentially saying to civil servants and public servants, have technology, it will give you control. The services won't be very good, users won't get a good deal, but you will be in control. I suppose the internet going, you're giving away control, so the services better be great. And that's the sort of biggest dilemma that we're on now. And I think that this book gives an intellectual framework to that problem, which I'd never really understood. And the final thing I want to say, it is probably the worst compliment I could give you is, and having someone who's read the book from end to end several times, it's the best bibliography I've ever seen. It is literally, for the students, the most useful book I've got, and I've got a lot of books. So thank you very much for 11 years of very hard work.
If I can come to you, Darja, Vinnova is also used as an example and a case study in the book, especially around that agile stability and how you're sort of trying to reframe that culture. So I'd love for you to also have a chance to respond to the book.
Well, thank you. I'll just start with checking if you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
So many things in the book that would be wonderful to touch on. I'll just start, if you just short, my background is actually not in public service from the beginning. 10 years ago, I was running my own companies, but then we were using design methodologies in innovation teams to help corporates innovate their products and value propositions, meaning a few things before I became Director General of the Innovation Agency were kind of a given. So the value of using design disciplines to increase the quality in how you understand the problem, how you facilitate processes that engage, create commitment, how you use, for instance, prototyping to kind of find a way around how the importance of foresight, etc. So that comes into this whole discussion that we heard, like how these ideas blend together. But then I also recognize some reflections in the book on the limitations of the lab version of things, that you actually prove things, you build culture, you build experience, but it's difficult to scale from there. So I guess the theme of the discussion so far has been a lot around the innovator's dilemma, the agile stability thing, and my reflection would be that yes, and that we also recognize from any kind of large organization, you have this constant need to kind of provide stability, quality, predictability, and handle uncertainty, create new options, opportunities, and try them out. And that's definitely like one of the core challenges for any leader right now, I would say. And it has some individual perspectives in it too. So therefore, it's been really inspirational. I would echo Mike in the terms of thank you for providing a lot of the framework. First of all, I'm very inspired by the idea of charismatic networks, and the way I see it, we've already come a long way in the dialogue around and practices in the public sector. And Mike, you mentioned the people who helped you, but in my world, I mean, Mike Bracken, Christian Basin, people in Singapore, Dan that I had the opportunity to work with are important people, and I know that they've had tremendous impact. So a heartfelt thank you for the book, Rainer, Wolfgang, Erkki. It means a lot. It's like an inspirational, educational, qualitative mirror for us all to kind of have a framework to reflect on. Now, coming back to the unwritten chapter 8 then, and echoing, Mariana, where we said that innovation, it's not only political, it is actually existential at this point in time. And I think we all agree, these deadlines we're fighting now, they're set by the planet. There has been tremendous development the last couple of years with all the lessons from the pandemic. But there is another story in terms of the awareness, the commitment, the willingness to take risk and to lead, not least in industry. If we're optimists, we can see it also a bit at the EU level, not least with the impact of missions thinking. And yet we're not on track at all. And that's why it's, again, like we used to talk about public sector innovation to make the consumption of public sector services so easy that anyone can do it. Yes, it's wonderful to be able to pay my taxes with one click and everything. But right now, the challenge is really, if we're going to scale the technologies we have at the speed that we need to even get close to achieving the goals, then we really need innovations in bureaucracy. And these are very practical things, like how do we get the permits? How do we negotiate the goal conflicts? How do we involve citizens to make these solutions trustworthy, etc.? So I guess at Vinnova, we tried, Mike, I was a bit starstruck when we met the first time to do the strategies delivery version. I'm very grateful for all the work that Dan Hill did, reminding you all that he actually also contributed through a book with our experiences, using design methodology to be an agent of change, unpacking the problem of how do we get to a point of sustainable and healthy food systems. One of the key lessons learned there was also to help both the institutions involved, be it schools, other government agencies, understand what it means in practice to build multiple positive outcomes. Ourselves trying out being an even more active agent of change, I would argue we were before, trying to find the deep demonstrator thing, like what's the recipe that can scale? If we're trying to build a system that will not only provide the food we need, but create the market at the same time, address the need for changed behavior, values, where can we do that? So that's why school food was an interesting point. But I can't help when I have the chance, we're also trying out a few other ways of scaling these practices. There are researchers leading innovation programs connected to the EU mission of climate neutral cities, where they have bureaucratic innovations such as climate contracts between cities and government agencies and connecting them internationally with the experiments. There's also right now the biggest innovation program that we can launch in Sweden will be built on this, where we invite then academia, industry, and the institutions necessary to create shared missions and kind of have this kind of emerging portfolio of experiments to learn from. So these are really interesting times for us. One of the key things we know we need to get better at is actually learning from everything that didn't work. So I'm super grateful both for the framework. This is going to be a study book for my management team as well. So thank you for a great reflection and contextualization. And I want the chapter 8, when will it be published? And maybe 9 on the version of where to go from. Thank you.
Great, so we've got a bit of time for questions, but actually I wondered, Wolfgang, did you want to start by responding a little bit more around the point of austerity, and that I maybe have a discussion, like kind of bounce back a little bit around that, the stability, austerity, opportunity, challenge?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, of course, and I'm happy to talk for about 8 hours nonstop about the evils of the new public management. This is one of my signatory things, but the important thing for me here is that the one justification the new public management had is that at a time when there was a feeling of a too expensive, too big state, it had, if you will, a house cleaning function, and it was able to bring things down. The problem in Central and Eastern Europe was that you started with a house cleaning function when there was no house, and that leads to catastrophic results. But the problem is, if this becomes a fundamental ideology upon which you build and justify the system, this is where it comes from. So if you use something, and I think you actually hinted at that, if you use something as a rhetorical device, it can be really powerful, but you need to be extremely strong to then rein that in. You find that so often in politics that certain ideologies are used to get a certain result, and then it's out there and the people who started it can't take it back. Yeah, and I think this is the problem here. In the if we are talking something that you in a way suggested, these Schumpeterian, neo-Schumpeterian waves in these reforms, which I also see and which we've seen many times in public administration. The problem is if you accelerate one of the waves so much that it flops out and turns into a tsunami, this is where the problem is. And if we are talking about, which we do in the book, about a balance between agile and stable, if there is an ideology that kills the stability rather than reduce it by limiting it, I mean, wanting to limiting it is absolutely fine, but once it ruins what you have, if it leads to a delegitimization of the public sector, if it leads to people staying out of the civil service because it has become so uncool, and that is something, in a sense, the ideology is dead, but these kind of legacies are partially still there. And that is the problem that I mean. The creative and important role of the critique of the stable bureaucracy that has the tendency to be an imperial bureaucracy of the Sir Humphrey Appleby type, absolutely is there and acknowledged. Nobody of us three certainly would challenge that. The problem is then the excess it moves into. So that is what my answer to your very well taken point would be.
Did you want to come back?
Well, I think it's worth it.
Mike.
I buy that completely, and I don't want to make this a UK specific conversation, because you said the Eastern Europe or where the house doesn't exist, that is entirely valid. I think that we have to recognize that the wave that preceded the last 10 years and rise of digital governments was a waste of an astonishing level of disregard for public outcomes by people who are not aligned to the sort of neoliberal view of the world. So there's a piece of research, forgive me, the name's just gone out of my head, that shows the success rate of technology-based projects in the US federal system. And it's well referenced, that's why I can't remember it. And it shows that 83% failure rate for IT projects across, a vast amount of projects. And we accept that. When I came to government in the UK, we were spending £16 billion a year on technology. Our parliament, nothing to do with that, our parliament issued a report called A Recipe for Rip-Offs, described it as an oligopoly, which is one stop short of a cartel. We literally couldn't spend any more money, and yet everything was broken. Not everything, that's unfair. An awful lot of stuff that really should not have been broken wasn't working. The point is that we'd gone through 15, 20 years of procurement practices, outsourcing, technology service delivery for extraordinarily poor outcomes for people. And yet the very people I'm complaining is, the neoliberal assault will reduce the amount of money in the system. And actually the reduction in the amount of money in the system was probably a good idea, because we digitized stuff from 40 to 80%. Your point is, in doing so, I think that the critical thing that the book shows is that an outcome or a target, right? And sort of anecdote time, but when I came to government, the minister responsible said, what's your saving? Oh, every head of profession in government had a savings target. What's your target? I said, I'm not going to have one. I'll give you the outcomes. You got 4 billion out of the system as a civil servant. That was my job. But if you have a target, you just get a slightly less worse version than you have when you start. Innovation comes from not having a target, but being able to innovate and seeing what the outcome is, both in financial terms and in service terms. And I think that what the next chapter of the book could do is, because you haven't got long now, is to put in some of the sort of tools in there, or some of the techniques in there of how you do, because much of those things are hidden in quite nuanced things about sort of treasury processes or finance sign-offs or business cases. They're not sort of startlingly big policy breakthroughs. They're actually in the mechanics of most governments. Like, I spend most of my time talking to CFOs or treasury heads about relatively arcane changes in their budgeting processes, which will affect the sorts of changes that they want to see.
I guess another thing building on that, I suppose, is around the role, what people see the role of government being and doing, and who's sort of taking that leadership position. Interesting as well from Darja's point of view around this kind of lab position and a third, like another agency. I suppose, sorry, I'm not articulating well, but even in the book, it's like Siemens is someone from the outside who's trying to shift government behavior. So I wondered if you wanted to pick up on that point.
Yeah, I think we were also surprised that historically, because we had all the sort of externally built labs or GDS as an example was driven by external people. And we were actually not thinking that historically that's the case as well. So because there is this almost like a mythology that we always have this very strong state, particularly in the European context. If you think about France or Germany or the Scandinavia, that they're always been strong state and only neoliberalism sort of undermined it. But actually, when you go back in history, you always find, particularly in the Western and European context, that a lot of these things were like public-private kind of partnerships. There was lots of experimentation. There was lots of false starts. There was lots of bad things happening, but there wasn't like a big vision in the beginning. I think that was really what was, I think, interesting to find out. And that's where our sort of theoretical discussion started as well. It's not only the sort of barbarian systems and then we break them, but it's actually, there is this a multiple ways of thinking about that. And yeah, I think the nature of today's bureaucracy is very much around civil service, which is very often quite closed maybe for good reasons. So how do you get new people, different kinds of people, not only in terms of skills, but also gender, race, all of those things becomes more and more important. I think that's what our, at the moment, final chapter, I hear there's lots of like new chapters being added. So I fear for the second printing of the book. It's like but I think that's one of the key issues as well, is actually how do you get much more diversity in the civil service, but also diversity in organizations. So I think we come from 20th century where we think about the public sector as a kind of the same type of organizations being replicated from education to health to all that. But actually what we show is that diversity in these organizations actually is a good thing, because it's, in evolutionary biology, this is also a good thing. If you have diversity, you don't die out. And I think otherwise you have the danger of, as a state or a government, to die out. Thank you.
Darja, did you want to come in terms of this almost redefining what this charismatic network is?
Well, I'm just smiling because, I mean, yes, I agree. We know from a lot of different types of research how important it is with diversity in general. And bringing in new types of people. And I think that's really like, and giving it mandate, a reflection I do. And that has a lot to do with hiring practices, basically. And I think that's something that is, and again, in terms of government, just are we asking for outcomes? Are we asking for if there's risk-taking examples? Are we asking for, etc.? So there's a lot of kind of practical things that really help build this kind of capability. A reflection I make, though, and then I was thinking a lot about, maybe because I was reading other things in parallel, when we do these things, at least the way I perceive it, both in this book, you also talk about the need for agency, right? That's another change. It has to do with the civil servant identity. Are we agents for change, or are we maintaining and actually doing both? There's a lot of strength in agency. It has a certain therapeutic value at the individual and organizational level. I think it has a whole lot of value also to attract the kind of people you need to build a culture where that's clear. But then it also becomes more difficult. So what I was thinking about when reading a book was also about what kind of capabilities. There's something called the inner development framework, the inner development goals, that has to do with being in terms of understanding yourself, thinking in terms of critical thinking, forecasting, communication in terms of co-creation processes, communication skills. It's actually an interesting framework. And I think that's another way this kind of reasoning takes me, like, what are the capabilities that we need in civil service as leaders, as civil servants, and as a society, because I think we're pretty much the same. So agency was one of the words that came to mind beside diversity. Thanks.
Thank you. And actually, that's a lot of what public practice is also doing, is we do it much more at local government level, but thinking really around the recruitment process. Again, it's so simple, but being almost best practice to support diversity and do a kind of non-biased recruitment process, but also thinking about exactly what are those attributes and skills that we think are important to have in government around, like you said, one of the things we've been thinking about quite a lot around is resilience, given where we are at the moment, and almost the kind of strong stomach you need to have to deal with the difficult time ahead. So yeah, I think it's a really good point. I'm going to open it up for questions now. So please raise your hand and a mic will come to you to ask the question. Should we keep one? I'll give you that one. And everyone online as well, please add your questions in the chat and we'll come to you. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. Lucy Kimball, Central St. Martin's. My question is about democratic politics intersecting with bureaucracies. It makes sense that in the agile mode that co-creation with citizens and all the work that GDS did and other entities are doing, experimentation, learning from citizens and so on is part of that. And I wondered if you could just share some perspectives on the stability side of bureaucracy and how contestation, agonistic forms of co-creation play out in the need for stability that you identify with bureaucracy.
We take one by one, or
should we maybe take two?
Yeah, we'll take a couple of questions.
Yeah, take a couple of questions.
Easier.
This one in the back.
Good.
Hello, yeah, my name is Jake Sumner. I'm a fellow here as well, and I worked in national government, local government, and regional government, as well as the private sector and voluntary sector. And partly it picks up slightly the point of the last question, some others that have been made, which is the discussions more have been around government bureaucracy at the governmental level and how innovation does or doesn't happen in that and stability environment. What do you have to say, I suppose, around national government's relationship with regional and local government, which has a lot of delivery? I work in local government at the moment. We deliver 1,200 services in the largest authority in Europe. And actually the practices of national government, for example, on doling out grants is through competitive bids, which this government thinks is innovative, although past governments have done that, and it inhibits innovation because it stop, start. There isn't the stable environment. The stable environment is only that there will be competitive bids periodically for certain pots of money. And what's happening is people can't invest in long-term value creation. And so was there anything that came out of that? And I realize it's small city states, so perhaps there's less of the local government angle, but is very relevant for Britain, or England, I should say, because it's the most centralized state or country in the OECD.
Thanks, Jake. I love a question about local government. We'll take one more question if that's all right.
Thank you. Thank you for what looks like a fascinating book. Rainer and I have discussed this. I'm Julio Davila from the Development Planning Unit here in the Bartlett in UCL. I'm interested in the sort of how we translate these lessons into the countries that my colleagues and I work on, which are essentially the global South. I don't like the term, but let's use it as a shortcut. In Southeast Asia and Latin America and in Africa, and looking at local government, which is very important because that's where the world population is going to grow in the next 50 years, because that's where people are going to migrate, and that's where cities are going to be growing, and it's going to have easily 80% of the population. So looking at Latin America, I've been very interested in local government and how they innovate in terms of, for example, transport and social development. And what I've seen, and this is what I've dedicated but last 20 years of my life, what I've seen is that these innovations, which are the ones that interest me, are about the poor and how to redress the imbalances, social, spatial, economic, and otherwise, that capitalism throws at us, that by the local government through things like transport and social services. Now, the issue that I've observed there is, yes, you do need a bureaucracy and you do need to pay people well. And to my delight, my students now prefer to go to local government in Latin America than to, or to national government, than to private firms because they're paid better. So pay is an important thing, which I think people in this country probably take for granted, but it's not the case anyway. Certainly it's not the case in sub-Saharan Africa. So I wanted to ask you about the role of that, the capacity to attract local government, but secondly, the role of leadership. Because in many of these contexts, local contexts, you've got an elected mayor or figure who is able to attract and create sort of a charisma and a sense of purpose around a project. Now, that may die with the next elected government, but to what extent do you regard leadership as important?
Thank you very much. Really interesting, quite big question. So should we start with the question around co-creation and working with citizens?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I can make a start, but feel free to. I think all great questions, of course, and wonderful new chapters to be written for the book. So it's like it will be a proper, like a 19th century, 2 volumes, all that in 10 years' time. So book your tickets to the next launch. But I think Lucy, is to start from your wonderful question about how do you think about the contestation in the sort of the stable function of government, if you will. I think it's a wonderful question because the Weberian solution was because we get experts in the government and they in their own heads they have the discussion pretty much. That was the idea, because you got people who know about stuff and there should have the ethical integrity to do that. And of course we know that's not always the case. And a lot of the new public management criticism, of course, comes from that we expect bureaucrats to be, the superhumans that can actually contest all of those ideas in their heads. And how do you do that? I think my answer actually is today's society is very much about diversity, and that you purposely need to, not only in terms of like race and gender, but particularly in terms of people's background. So again, when I think Darja mentioned the Vinnova's work around streets mission in Sweden, I think. And if you look at the planning department, for instance, in a city like Stockholm and other places, how many people they hire who are actually not planners, who are actually maybe anthropologists, or like Julia from a planning unit and looking at much more sociological issues. I think this is where sort of the contestation has to come from, this consciously driving the diversity of viewpoints, sense-making practices, which we can't anymore just assume that people coming to bureaucracy all have that. Maybe they never did, actually. Maybe that's the point. It's always sort of a kind of an hegemonic practice anyway. So that was my answer. You want to take another one?
Okay, I can. Yes. So it has always been a cliche that traditional bureaucracy, which sometimes people call Weberian because they think it's exactly the same, is monolithic and only state-driven and doesn't co-create or anything like that. But since the conceptualization in Western thought of societies with various bases of decision-making, it has been the case that this system has been more open, pretty much the 1600s, right? Althusius and so on. And as Rainer has actually pointed out, you need more state capacity for governance than for government, because you do need all the expertise and you still need to moderate the various views. This is much more a tradition and always has been. And certainly something that Weber acknowledges that you have. And I do think a lot of it has also to do with the legitimization. Do I have systems in which people seriously believe that bureaucrats act for them or not? Do I have this kind of trust of a large majority who says, these bureaucrats will take care of this with top results, for which, as Mariana has reminded us, we need innovation. The classic example of that is or was Singapore, which was mentioned before, in which you have at least at any question, 70% of all people would say, I may not understand what the department head decides, but I let them go because my experience shows that in the end, it's better for me if I do that. And of course, there is a political side to this as well. Now, our book doesn't acknowledge, to come back to the third question, the Global South enough, because enough would be overwhelmingly so, but we do have examples from these regions, and some of the best that we do show are, of course, from East Asia, classic success stories. And, Singapore, although it's in Southeast Asia, really functions as an East Asian country. And there is various meanings to the term Weberian. The one is a very specific Prussian bureaucracy around 1900. The other is really this kind of responsible, hierarchical, and so on system, under which you can qualify the best performing or even middle performing East and Southeast Asian countries as well. But then a political element comes in. There are actually systems in which it is known what the right solution would be, and it's still not taken because the lock-in effect leads to positive political gains from the people in power. Yeah, so there is these elements, but the competence and the institutions, the awareness of reflection, I would see in this areas is as good as here, if not better. So it's an interesting thing, and the more we talk about that, obviously, the better, which I think we are trying to do. Erkki?
Yeah, I made some 3 points actually based on the questions that you had here. And I think one important thing when we, what makes or should be emphasized is that, it's easy to take the argument that you need agility and stability and you need them both in public sector organizations. But I think most countries, most government organizations actually first need to analyze their baseline, right? That you probably don't have, even if you have stable governments today or stability-oriented bureaucracies, they are not actually oriented in the right kind of stability, kind of patient funding, having a long-term view, having an emphasis on, getting complex problems solved. So I think in that sense, I think we have it also in a book, a quotable or tweetable line, something like that, that new public management sort of killed stability in the public sector organization, attempted it and bring agility, but it actually also killed agility to some extent for a very simple reason that majority of the tasks we are facing and where we need innovation are very much about uncertainty, which is what you said, that you cannot really measure, but then, you set a KPI, right? So what we get at is that most public sector strategies, when they have a KPI and they have a linear view of how to solve problems, are actually lying. Because the truth is that we don't know how to go ahead, right? And we haven't built actually the capabilities to deal with this kind of uncertainty. So I think you would need to have a kind of a much better baseline in terms of what kind of stability we have in public bureaucracies in order to link that with agility. And that leads, I think, to the second point, which relates to, somebody asked a question about sort of politics and how this plays in. And I think the politics, we actually cover this in a way through the lens of legitimacy. So what is actually the legitimacy of the government to being involved in this innovation game, and where this kind of neo-Weberian initiatives might be emerging, or the charismatic networks. And I think the contexts are very different. I mean, ideally, everyone would want to have a Kennedy to take the blame, right? So that you try something, you fail, and then somebody from politics says, I'm sorry. But most countries really don't have this kind of thing. So what you see is that, you hide to some extent this kind of initiative somewhere away from political oversight, or, hide maybe is actually like a wrong word here, but Fred Block uses the term hidden development of state. That if you don't have a legitimacy, you hide it, but probably it gets hidden by itself. I would argue that, that you have in some countries, you really have, like the Japanese government about 10 years ago or something like that, they had in Prime Minister's office the most crazy innovation projects. They had, I think it was from the Prime Minister's office, they were financing an initiative to develop the most productivity enhancing song, so that you can actually put it on during the break in a factory to cut down the minutes of the break in order to improve the productivity of the workers and the total output, right? Well, if you would come out with this kind of initiative in most countries, you get fired much faster than you would have got fired as well, right? All right. So you actually have this kind of, but you have these countries where you have this kind of legitimacy and you're able to build this kind of, or these networks emerge very centrally. Most cases it's hidden somewhere, or it emerges in a lower levels or in the outskirts of the government or something like that. But I think an important element that leads to that is that what I point here or use the term is that you need, when you think about sort of how to create this agility and stability, this idea that you need to have kind of a problem, method, context fit, right? So these things need to come together. What type of a method you use to foster agility? It needs to fit the problem you're dealing with. You cannot, think every solutions to every kind of problems. You need sometimes use experimentation, other times totally different methods, right? but it needs to also fit the context, right? So, and I think this leads to, I always like this, there's a blog in UCL website that says that movements with missions make markets or something like that. But I think the idea is also here is that, you know, we need to think that these kind of charismatic networks emerge, like movements with missions. In a way, they are these things and right methods. And these things are that we historically can now find when we do this case studies analysis. But if you turn this into the kind of policy practice, then if you have a baseline of a strong enough bureaucracy, having a long-term view and ability to take risks, their task is actually pick the willing movements, right? To find actually what is sort of the networks, the charismatic networks emerging, and nurture them and foster them. And I think when we think about today's challenges, then most governments, when you would try to link this to your question, kind of would really need to also rethink, you know, the role divisions. What should be solved on a national level? What should be actually the task of the local level? Because technologies are changing, the practices are changing, and so in a sense, the subsidiarity is changing. You know, what is the best level for certain activities might be very much changing. If you have a global platform, you don't have to have a national policy. You can take things very quickly to the personal, local community level and stuff like that, right? So I think it's a very important, these things. And if you're going back to this problem method context fit, I think you might also have this kind of a very easy kind of a mistake or a problem that you kind of try to re-engineer practices, right? Take co-creation to different places and stuff like that. And, you know, introduce this method still from top down or as a civil service servant, but you would actually first need to kind of figure out what kind of method your local communities or countries prefer and foster that. So that, you know, I see in Estonian case that we come from a country where the house is not in order, how was the terminology, our house is not there, but we have also very, very kind of top-down and government-centric view of things. And whenever we do like participatory methods or co-creation methods, the cynicism you see in the room is like extreme, right? Because nobody believes that that fits into our administrative culture. So we should actually use a totally different method. So it's very important to kind of really understand that context in order to choose the right methods that bring this kind of a dynamism. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Darja, did you want to come in on the national-local government relationship and bits?
Yeah, I'd love to. And actually, there was so much that I just heard Erkki say that I think is very valuable. So thanks. Well, first of all, the national, or say local, regional, national, up to international. Just so there was a comment that the UK, even Sweden, just 10 million people, but we have 290 municipalities with a lot of autonomy and huge responsibilities. That means that we're very much struggling with that as well. And then there was a comment on the competitive bids. So let's just say this way, I think that one of the things, there are these, you know, mental ideas of why do we have competitive bids from a Swedish perspective? It would be you say, okay, but we want equal treatment. That's really important. How do we get that? You have these traditions from how do you secure bet on excellence, etc. There are some workarounds in terms of blah, blah, blah. Yes, it's a challenge. The main challenge would be what does it take to get these different levels in the room in the issues or challenges where it really makes a difference? And there we have, you know, if we're going to have equal treatment, you can't do it for every single case. So you have to find a way of doing so. That's why I think there's a lot of potential and opportunity. I would love to hear some other people comment on that, on the place-based approach together with sandboxes. Because if you have one challenge and you say, we're going to frame this in a kind of a local context, we're going to address it here, and there you get the relevant national government agencies as well with a very clear purpose, like let's try to solve this challenge. And once you find the recipe, then back to Erkki's point, maybe you know where the problem, who should solve the problem next time. But that's something I didn't hear about so much. Like the practices about sandboxes and comments on that would be interesting from my perspective. And we need this kind of place-based approach, because I agree, we need the multi-level governments to work, really, and it's not right now.
And we've got lots and lots of questions online. Hopefully some of those questions that are online have been answered already, but I'm just going to pick out a couple of them. So maybe I'll start with two. One is from Beatrice Belmont, asking how ready do you think society is to accept an innovative government that tries and fails? And the second question is, what is the role of political will in nurturing the entrepreneurial bureaucracy?
These are minor questions.
Both?
Yeah, I'm not sure these are my question, but I think there is something that, you know, when we think about the risk taking, and there is so much, we always, like, a knee-jerk reaction is to say that bureaucrats and the government are very risk averse. On the other hand, you can argue for a very good reason, because you don't want your pension systems to be, you know, innovated constantly on, and you want them to be there in 30, 40 years time. But I think on the other hand, I think our idea of uncertainty is very much driven by markets rather than uncertainty from a climate perspective or any other these kind of fundamental challenge. And I think this is where rather than social acceptance, it is much more perhaps about thinking about the methodologies we work with when we design public services and how do we implement them. So rather than thinking the outright acceptance, but it's actually in my mind, it's more about the methodologies. How do we work with them? Political will. I don't know whether anybody wants to take that. Mike, you want to have a stab on that, or political will? Because you have experience in that.
Yeah.
Sphere.
What's the question? Is a political?
Again, so it's from Anir Chaudhry, who's asking, what's the role of political will in nurturing the entrepreneurial bureaucracy?
I think it's vital. It really is important that you get strong political leadership cover and the ability to spend political capital on things that's not immediately vote winning in the name of sort of innovation and reform. I think to sort of answer the question that will come is I think we are going to have, going from my experience, which having a political leader at the center of government who was very strong in terms of leadership for whatever political reason, but being a rarity, I think you're going to have a sort of slightly next level. We've got a generation of politicians now who understand that they can come into government with an incredibly small number of people, often around the digital services or digital skills, and effect one or two single policies. And I think that they will look at that and say, can I just do that as a sort of mission, or as a single issue politician, rather than can I engage with the mechanisms of the whole of the state? In the same way that's happened in politics, where people have essentially hijacked the political process using digital and data, I think you'll see that in sort of single issue politicians coming in with that. That's not all good by any means, but I deal with a lot of governments and a lot of politicians currently outside of the political system who are gearing up to come in. And they're going like, well, when I get my guy, I'm going to do this one or two things with this data because I know now it can be done. And the model of actually digitizing and changing governments and demonstrating how innovation can work quickly, because the future comes at you more quickly now in the internet age, is that politicians will become more, they have a stronger view about that, how they can get stuff done quickly. As I say, in the wash, that's not all good. There'll be some good and some bad.
So I'm going to take two quick questions from the floor, if that's all right.
So to your point earlier about bureaucracy being seen as a kind of an insult, it seems that it's almost taken for granted in the public debate that the public sector is broken, it's wasteful, it's inefficient, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, you know, the streets are clean. No one's ever came late to pick up the trash. You know, at my place, at least I noticed. and you know, the system for filing my taxes, you know, is easier than the system I use at work to file my expense report. Right? So in a way, it seems to me like there's a paradox that actually we have what by any reasonable standards is successfully, I mean, a spectacularly successful public sector, but that's somehow still seen as sort of the apotheosis of failure and inefficiency. So I'm interested in sort of why is that, and what does it mean for that bureaucracy's ability to balance those the kind of the twin objectives of agility and stability.
And we'll take one more.
Hi, thank you very much for this fascinating conversation and book as well. I would like to know what is your opinion about what is the best selection process for selecting like agile entrepreneurial bureaucrats, because I do think it's an important point here in this discussion, because at least in my experience, I'm half academics, half civil servant, let's say. In the context of Mediterranean countries like Spain, like Italy, like France, and so on, you have like an extremely awful and terrible selection process, where basically you are telling the citizens, hey, study these like 200 different topics during 3, 4, 5 years without being paid, for sure. You have to take all of that time without working and without studying in a way. And when you get finally the employee, it's like a lottery, because you are going to have employment for life. So that gives you this extreme stability, but I think in a way that it destroys the agile, you know, because but it's a conundrum, and at least in this kind of European countries, it's like you cannot change that, because even the trade unions, they are going to defend that, the public trade unions, they're going to defend that system. And then even you can see that the public managers, they are not bosses anymore, because they cannot really like move that. So I would love to know if you have in your book or in your ideas like the best selection process that you have come up. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. The first thing is bureaucracy as a term. You know, it comes from buros, or the bureau, and kratein, to rule, and it has always been meant as a critic, as an insult, to hijack bureaucracy back and use it as an almost positive word for the public sector. This is a special thing. So if we talk about civil servants or the public sector or something like that, that can be good or bad. But bureaucracy as a term is not positive, and you need to kind of force it that it means something positive. But one of the answers to what you mentioned is what this book is about, namely innovation bureaucracies. One of what I think, and I will now avoid the term neoliberal to be safe, of the tricks of a certain kind of reform was to sell to the people that the job of the state is public service provision. But public service provision is one part, and one part only. It's nice if you know when your bus arrives, but that is not what saves the planet. So the strategic thinking and all of these things, the idea of larger and future things, that is a completely different story than what Friedrich Jünger calls convenience, and which can lull you in a certain sense of accepting a system that is there. What I think is very important here also is that with the term bureaucracy, and this is again the Singapore example, that people whine about bureaucrats is normal. It is part of human civilization, because public sector decisions are choices, and choices will have losers, and losers are going to whine. This is how it is. But there is, and we know that in the public management field much better than it's in the general view, that acceptance and appreciation of your bureaucracy has nothing to do with that whining. You have a complete culture of the Hokkien uncles in the kopitiam in Singapore who are spending 3 hours every morning whining about the bureaucracy, and they all love it in the end, because they know that what it actually does, also future-oriented, is correct. So this kind of thing is not the one and the other. A little answer, not the main one, to you. One of the examples we, by the way, have is the classical Chinese system, once again, to get out of this, this Western bias that we always have. We talk about innovation bureaucracy, and one of these things was, through the concept of the mandate of heaven, a radical link to performance and to overall performance. That means, are the people happy? Do they survive? Are they fed? Is there a war? And the Chinese system was to say, if you don't deliver, from the emperor to the smallest bureaucrat, you have to go. And if you don't want to go, there are ways to make you leave. That means you get both agility and stability if the end is the positive large-scale result of what we agree on are the societal and therefore the state goals. But that's just from the side, and I'm mentioning it because we're mentioning it in the book.
Great. So I might actually just try and close with one last question, which is online, which is a bit more of a personal question. So it feels like it's a nice way to close it. So it's from Olga Makiva, who says, no, each of you has to do it. It's a question from Olga asking, what social or life experience defined or contributed to your interest in public bureaucracies? You asked me to chair.
Yes, I can start out. And hello, Olga. I know you're sick. Is another PhD student of ours. So I think, from my perspective, very quickly, I think I was born in Soviet Union, and the process of transformation, that what came afterwards was really transformative in terms of like the extreme, pre-market theorism and things like that. Actually, brought my attention to the collective action. Actually, why don't we actually think about doing things together or providing services rather than think that the market can do everything? So that was for me really the foundational experience.
This gives me the chance to be very Western traditional and say that Aristotle says that the goal is the good life in the good state. And we do not have a peaceful and truly inclusive and future-oriented life if the good state isn't well administered by good public and civil servants. And how to get these so that we all can live in the best possible way for ourselves, for our peers, and for the planet is dependent on a good state, well administered by good civil servants. And how to study that? What a great goal for one's life is that.
Very simply saying, when I went to university, I come from Estonia. The time was when people wanted to do something. They went to study governance or public policy, because it was the kind of nation building, joining the EU and stuff like that. So that was the normal thing. If you went to work for business or study business or law or something like that, then this was like a second order choice. You just want to get rich. We want to do something. So for whoever writes the chapter 8, I guess the time is coming back, because, when we think about the challenges we are facing, I guess this bold ideas and bold big problems, and to tackle them are getting back there. So I guess, yeah, just normal context and life. How it happens. And then why I stayed there was that my first lecture in the university was given by a German guy who was talking about Ambrogio Lorenzetti and the allegory of good and bad government from Siena Town Hall. So, you go to university, you assume that this is some kind of a academic theory and stuff like that. And then one guy shows pictures of a Siena Town Hall. If they said, if this is studying bureaucracy, then let's do it. It's like studying arts and crafts. So yeah, that was the background.
Amazing. Thank you. Was from your... Sorry about that, Mike. On that note, firstly, thank you so much, Mike and Darja, for joining us today. Let's have a huge round of applause for Pooja. I feel like we're all talking about the next book, but let's read this book first, and don't listen to Ryan. I read all of it, and it's available upstairs, but I'm sure online as well. But everyone here, it's available in the room upstairs. So we'll see you there for a drink.
There are drinks upstairs. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.